Welcome back to the Native Speaker Lightning Lessons. Here we're going to look at some more common mistakes and how to avoid them. And this common mistake, I am not agreed. 3. Students often make mistakes when saying what they don't agree with. The correct versions are, of course, I don't agree with you that it is expensive. I didn't agree with him about that decision. She won't agree to a price increase. Students often say something else, like I am not agree, I was not agree, or she is will not agree. These are all bad mistakes, and don't make them. So how about, say my students, I want to say I don't agree with something, but in a fancy schmancy way. No problem. Let's have a look. I would start with the phrase, I'm not sure I. Okay? And I have to say to students for this lesson, how you practice saying this will affect how successful you are at using this phrase, because it's a little bit long. So start off by saying, I'm not sure I, and then we have to use the phrase necessarily agree with. Necessarily agree with. This word can be quite deceptive. In other words, it tricks students sometimes in its pronunciation. And I have a very simple way of helping you to pronounce this. Imagine that there are 3 people living inside this word. A girl called Nessa, a girl called Sarah, and a guy called Lee. Nessa, Sarah, Lee. Nessa, Sarah, Lee. Necessarily. So I advise students who find this a bit of a mouthful to practice first this section, I'm not sure I, I'm not sure I, I'm not sure I, and then practice necessarily. I'm not sure I, necessarily. I'm not sure I, necessarily. Practice saying it correctly first and then work on your speed. Don't try and say it too quickly at the start. It's like learning to ride a bike or drive a car. If you try to drive or cycle too quickly at the start, well, you're going to crash. So that can happen with you here. So I'm not sure I necessarily agree with. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with. And then you'll say the something that. So what kind of words will go in here? Well, words like idea, concept, notion, or theory. So you'll say, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the idea that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the idea that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the concept that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the notion that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the theory that. And you can play back the video now and practice speaking that along with my voice until you're doing it yourself correctly. And then you'll say the subject, verb, object, adjective, complement. So for example, if you're talking about the Queen and what she should do, you could say, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the idea that the Queen, and then the verb phrase might have 1 or 2, or look here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words in the verb phrase. 4 of them are verbs and we have 1 preposition. So that's important for you to practice. So I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the concept that social media companies should be allowed to keep our data after we die. That word can be pronounced data or data. It's a word like schedule or either or either. It has 2 pronunciations. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the notion that private schools should be subsidized by the state. Subsidized means the state or the government pay a percentage of their costs. Not the total, but a percentage. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the theory that teachers should be responsible for dealing with student absences. So again, the pronunciation here gets a lot more attention in this lesson, and you have to make sure that you can pronounce this phrase properly, because if you can say it, you can write it. And I advise students to give that a lot more attention, more so than I usually do in other lessons. Let's look at the sentences now in completion. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the idea that the Queen should play a role in the running of the country. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the concept that social media companies should be allowed to keep our data after we die. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the notion that private schools should be subsidized by the state. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the theory that teachers should be responsible for dealing with student absences. So I think I may have said idea that here just out of habit, but I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the idea that, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the concept that, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the notion that. I may have said idea here. So notion like ocean. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the notion that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the theory that. So you can put in other words for idea like concept, notion, or theory. These are just 4 that can work quite well. Over here, you can also change it slightly, because some of you might have to do an exam where you're in an exam with another student. For example, like the Cambridge First Certificate, and you might have to say, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Marek that. So Marek is sitting beside you and you're talking about EU countries and that they should have to pay. So Marek says they should, and you're not sure you necessarily agree with him, and you say, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Marek that, and then say what Marek said. Or you could turn to Marek and speak directly to him. So in this case, you're speaking to the examiner about Marek, and in this case, you're speaking directly to Marek. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with you that all women are paid less than men, for example. And here you could use that as well. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Martina that, and then say what Martina said. Martina said that hospitals should be shut down during the pandemic. The pandemic is this other word for a global illness that's like a virus that's spreading. Or I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Ali that all flights to New York should be cancelled. So again, this can be very useful for you in exams in the speaking section, and it can also be useful for you in essays where you have to give your opinion on things. If you want to be less personal about it, you could develop these sentences a little bit more. So you could say, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Martina that hospitals should be shut down during the pandemic. Or I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Ali that all flights to New York should be cancelled. Don't forget, you can leave the object and the adjective out and the complement out. You can put in as much or as little as you want there. Now, to make it less personal, we could take out the names and say something using an impersonal phrase like, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with those who believe that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with people who say that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with doctors who feel that. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with those who say that. So these are some rather impersonal phrases about people who may have this opinion, but nobody said it to you directly. So these are very good, obviously, for essays, and you'd be able to use this phrase to talk about what many people think. And it's a great way of saying what you don't agree with, because when you're giving your opinion in Cambridge essays like IELTS and First Certificate and Cambridge Advanced, etc., you sometimes need to say what you don't agree with. So that's very important as well. So these are very, very important ways to develop your writing style. They're great for essays in college. They're great for work discussions, presentations, or reports as well. And the good thing about them is they use hedging techniques. In other words, you're not disagreeing 100%. You are really, but you're saying it in an academically sound way. You're saying it in a diplomatic way also. There's a little bit of sugar here. We understand that you disagree, but you're saying it in a gentler way. Okay, so you look more like a lady or a gentleman, or you look more like a good professional. You look calm, in control, and this is a style that native speakers use, quite simply, so you look more like a native speaker. This sentence type uses an indirect hedging style that is ideal for giving an opinion in academic writing, reading, and discussion. So, for example, essays, assignments, tutorials. It's very good for international English exams, for example, IELTS for certificate, Cambridge Advanced and Cambridge Proficiency. Business correspondence and discussion, example, emails, e-meetings and presentations, and media writing and discussion. So, for example, you'd see this in newspaper and magazine articles, radio and TV interviews. Basically, native speakers love to use this style, this what we call hedging style, because it's academically sound. In other words, you're not making an absolute generalization. It's also very diplomatic, so you look professional and calm and control. And it's kind of nice as well. It's very natural. Native speakers love to use it. If you'd like to know more about this, all the ins and outs of this and other language points, sign up for our new online course at info@nativespeaker.ie and you'll never have to make this mistake again. That's all from this Native Speaker Lightning lesson. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe and click the link for notifications. See you all next time.